standard. And at that point, some of the Treasury people came to me and other economic hitmen and said, listen, we can't allow OPEC to hold us up anymore. We can't allow them to blackmail us. You've got to come up with a scheme so this can't happen again. Well, the scheme that we came up with, and this is the short version, is that the House of Saud in Saudi Arabia, we knew we had to do it through the House of Saud because they were corruptible, and they had more oil than anybody else. The House of Saud agreed to return almost all the money that they made selling petroleum to the world to the United States and invested in U.S. government securities. The interest from those securities would be used to finance the westernization of Saudi Arabia, so that the Treasury Department would have that interest to hire U.S. corporations to build power plants, desalination plants, huge cities. And the House of Saud also agreed to keep the oil prices within limits acceptable to our oil companies, and most importantly perhaps, never ever to sell oil for anything other than dollars. So suddenly, in a couple of years, the dollar had moved from being on the gold standard to just being free-floating, basically, to now developing its own standard, the oil standard, which in many respects was much more powerful than the gold standard, because after all, oil has inherently more value in the modern world than gold does. And so today we've been struggling all these years with this same situation where we're on the oil standard. And now we're once again at this position where we hold tremendous amounts of debt. We're a huge debtor nation, the largest debtor nation in the world, in the United States. And other countries are beginning to say, but we want our debt in something other than dollars, because we don't like the dollar, we don't trust it. So Saddam Hussein threatened to go onto what he called an oil burst, oil exchange, where he would sell oil for something other than dollars, yen or euros or some other currency. And that's one reason that we went after him. That's just one more reason. And today, interestingly enough, Iran is doing the same thing. Iran is offering to sell oil. In fact, they say they want to sell oil not for dollars ever. They want to sell it for other currencies. This is a huge threat to us. I think it's the primary reason why we're making threats as if we're going to attack Iran. I don't think it has nearly as much to do with nuclear energy as we like to think it does. It has to do with oil and the oil bursts. Because if Iran, in fact, does sell oil for something other than the dollar, it puts the dollar in a very weak position. And if someone wants to bankrupt us, someone like China or Japan or one of the other big holders of our debt, they can call in our debt in euros or in something else. But they can only do that if they can buy oil in that other currency, because oil is the true currency that's out there today. Well, oil is the ideal fuel for the corporotocracy. And so when you have a resource like that, you can really control it. And of course the corporotocracy likes that. Also everything downstream. You have to have gas stations, you have to have pipelines, you have to have all these things. And that's a reason why biofuels, ethanol, things like that are acceptable to them, that more acceptable to Washington, to the corporotocracy, than, for example, solar, which you don't have that kind of control over. So oil is really it's a political football. It is a tremendous convenience for those who want to control, and it is the backing of our currency today. So the dollar is backed by oil. So it makes it very hard to talk about getting off oil from a political standpoint. If every tile on every roof was a solar panel, which is technologically possible, think of what that would do. Now, people who know energy know that there's peak times of using fuel, and you can't, it's hard to use solar at night, although it's definitely not impossible. We put solar units out for some of the communities in the Amazon, and they have big batteries that they put it into, and they run off solar all night long. You can do that, even though it seems that in this country, in the United States, it's almost like a myth that you can't do that, but you can do it. But if we think in terms of really trying hard to use what's there and to use it in an efficient way, the concept of huge solar stations out in the Mojave Desert or someplace, that to me is wrong, because once again it's feeding into the hands of central control. And not only that, but who knows what that would do for climate. If you take all that solar energy that would have gone into the earth otherwise, out of the earth, and instead put it into electricity, it's going to have some impact. But where we've got roofs, where the solar is just hitting the roofs anyway. What an efficient use. So we certainly need to look more and more and more at this whole thing of energy. And we know there's other technologies that are out there that we haven't really even explored with any sort of any sort of seriousness, because they don't fit within the context of the politics of the game. And I think something else is very important here, and that is that we must at some point come to grips with the fact that we've got to cut back on everything, whether we're talking about energy consumption or clothes or the size of our houses. We in the developed world, we who live in these very affluent societies like the United States, must cut back, because there are limitations on this planet. There's no question about it. And we're fast approaching those limitations. So we must cut back. We must control population to some degree, and we must control the per capita expenditure on economic goods, on materialistic goods. We must cut back. We cannot expect technology to solve these problems entirely. We have to also solve them by spirituality, by realizing, for lack of a better word, spirituality, by recognizing that happiness doesn't come through consuming more and more energy, consuming more and more products. It comes from something much deeper, something much more basic, that feeling of oneness, that bliss, that connection with all the plants and animals and elements and other people. We have a great deal of power over these corporations. And so we're at this amazing time in history where there's a world empire. And I think for the first time, we don't want to overthrow it. We don't want to get rid of it. We want to change it. We want to do something that's never been done in history before. We want to break an old pattern, because if this empire collapses, then history tells us that there'll probably be some wars, economic or military wars, and eventually some new empire will emerge. We don't want that. What we'd rather do is transform this empire, make it into a true model of a world where we can live sustainably, environmentally sustainably, in a socially just world, in a peaceful world. And so I think we have this opportunity now to tell those corporotocracy people, okay, go ahead, maximize profits, but only do so within the context of always heading toward creating an environmentally sustainable, a socially just, and a peaceful world for everyone on the planet. Because we know that our world won't be stable and just and sustainable unless the entire planet is. We live in a very, very small community. That's the other thing that's grown out of this empire, is the world community has shrunk tremendously. When I was an economic hitman in the 70s, several times I spent 3-4 days trying to make a phone call from Jakarta, Indonesia to Boston, Massachusetts. Today you can call any place on the planet instantaneously. You can go to the deepest part of the Amazon and through satellite phones. You can send a whole book by email almost instantaneously from any place on this planet. We are a very, very small world. And I have a grandson. He's about 6 months old now. I'm very aware of the fact that my grandson cannot possibly hope to inherit a sustainable, peaceful, stable, socially just world unless every child today growing up in Ethiopia, in Indonesia, in Bolivia, in Palestine, in Israel also has that same expectation. So here we are at this amazing time in history. Small world, ruled by the emperor, which is a corporotocracy, which is it's a corporate ruling, it's a commercial, it's an economic thing, it's not a military thing. And these corporations are very, very vulnerable. We can turn them around, and we must turn them around. Where does the desire to keep making more come from? Where does greed come from?
Sure.
I think that greed in a way is our measure of success. So if I'm a corporate executive and I'm making $5 million a year, and the guy in charge of my rival company is making $6 million, I feel I got to do better. I got to surpass him. That's my measure of success. If I'm an athlete, same sort of thing. The athletes are all vying with each other to see who makes the most money, because that's how we measure our success in general. And of course, it's a false measure of success, because we all know really happiness is the success. What kind of a life do we lead? How do we relate to our families? How do we relate to the world? And if in the process of making this extra $1 million as a corporate executive or a movie star or an athlete or whatever, we're also creating a bigger gap between us and the people in Indonesia who are making the shoes that we wear as an athlete or as a corporate executive, or the clothes that we wear as a movie star, then in the long run we're making this a much less stable world, a much more dangerous world for ourselves and our progeny. And so we must turn this thing around and really look at what is it that we value. It really isn't money. And you know, working with CEOs and people in top management for many, many years, as I've had, including I still continue to. I give talks to big corporations and their executives. I just came back recently from giving one. I'm very struck by the fact that I've never met an evil CEO. They may exist, but I haven't met any. I've never met one that wants to see Florida sink beneath the ocean. I've never met one that wants to see the ozone layer destroyed or wants to see more poverty and misery in the world. What I need is men and women who have been taught in business schools, who have been taught within their corporate cultures that they must maximize profits regardless of the costs, the social and environmental costs. But they don't really want to do that. And they're really not buying into this idea that they got to make an extra $1 million to compete with the guy in the next post. That's really not what they're about, as far as I can see. They do it because that is their measure of success. It's the same reason that it starts when we're in school, you know. I mean, the kid sitting next to us gets an A and we're getting a B, and there's pressure put on us to do better than them, or excel in a sport for whatever reason. With this constant thing of this is how we measure ourselves. We really need to turn that around. You know, it would be such a different world if the Fortune 500 were not the wealthiest 500 people or the wealthiest 500 companies, but instead were those that do the most to make a better world for our children. Just think if Randy Hayes, who founded Rainforest Action Network, was in the Fortune 500, not because of money he makes, but because of what he does. Just think, you know, what if people like that were Time Magazine's Man of the Year? This is the direction we must move in. And you and I can create that. It's in our hands to do that. And I also think we need to understand that almost every executive out there is looking for that too.
Obviously, they love their grandchildren. They don't want to see the entire world destroyed.
Well, it's our form of adulation. So, you know, how do we honor corporate executives? We honor them by making, but you know, they think they're being honored when they get more pay, when they get bigger bonuses, when their stock increases, because that's the system that we're buying into that says that's the measure of success. How much money do you have? How big is your house? How large is your yacht? How many private jets do you have? I mean, we the people make a big point of that. We watch television shows about this. We watch movies about it. And we say, oh, wouldn't it be nice if I had a big yacht like that and a huge mansion and 15 houses like that? Right. So, you know, we put these people in this position. It strikes me as amazing that we have reached a point in time where we even talk about the need to be sustainable. Because throughout history, everybody's always been sustainable. I spend a lot of time with indigenous people in places like the Amazon. They don't do anything that isn't sustainable. You just don't do it. If it isn't sustainable, it's not even possible or conceivable that you would do it. And so now here we are at a time where we've come through several hundred years of history doing non-sustainable things. And we're all sitting around now, big corporations are getting together for conferences on sustainability. Should we become sustainable? Can we become sustainable? Well, the obvious answer is if we don't become sustainable, by definition, we're not here any longer at some point. So we really must take into account the totality. This isn't just a human experience on this planet. This is a total experience. And we know we can't survive without plants and animals. We know we can't survive without the earth. We know we can't survive without the four elements, you know. And so when are we going to really start taking that into account and saying, that's what it is to be successful. Success depends on how well we relate to everything around us, not just other human beings, but all the things around us. That is success. And then we ought to really be honoring the people that take that into account. These ought to be our Fortune 500 people and the people who win all the awards and get on the covers of all the magazines, those who lead us in a direction towards sustainability. And in that